Day 79. That's how long Nancy Guthrie had been gone when a message appeared inside a Bitcoin wallet linked to her disappearance. 4 words that should have changed everything. We are ready to talk. But what happened next wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a negotiation. It was silence. Complete, absolute silence. And that silence might be the most terrifying clue in this entire investigation. Because when someone opens a door and then walks away from it, when someone creates a channel for communication and never uses it again, you have to start asking a different kind of question. Not, where is Nancy Guthrie, but whether she was ever meant to come back at all. This is the story of an 84-year-old woman who vanished from inside her own home in Tucson, Arizona. No forced entry, no struggle that made sense, no clear explanation for how she could simply cease to exist within the walls of a place she'd lived for years. But Nancy Guthrie isn't just any missing person. She's the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, and that connection transforms this case from a local mystery into something far more complex. Because when a public figure's family becomes a target, the question stops being random crime and starts becoming something calculated, something personal, something that was designed to hurt in ways most people can't imagine. The investigation has followed leads that seem to contradict each other. Ransom letters sent to television stations, a Bitcoin account that recorded one single transaction and then went dark. FBI profilers who believe the person responsible knew Nancy, had watched her, had planned this with a level of precision that suggests intelligence and patience. And now, a single strand of hair recovered from her bedroom, sent to the FBI laboratory at Quantico for testing that didn't exist just a few years ago. Testing that could finally answer the question everyone has been asking since the beginning. Who was in that room? But before we can understand where this investigation is going, we need to understand where it started. Because the details of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance don't just raise questions. They violate every pattern that experienced investigators expect to see. And those violations, they might be the only real clues we have. If you're interested in cases that challenge everything we think we know about crime, investigations, and the minds capable of committing acts that defy logic, make sure you like this video and subscribe to True Crime Files. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a missing woman. It's a story about silence, strategy, and the possibility that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who understand exactly how investigations work. Nancy Guthrie's home sits in a Tucson neighborhood that doesn't expect violence. The kind of place where people know their neighbors, where routines are predictable, where an 84-year-old woman should be able to sleep in her own bed without fear. But on the day Nancy disappeared, something entered that space, something that didn't belong. And when investigators arrived, what they found wasn't chaos. It was absence. The scene didn't scream abduction. There was no shattered glass, no damaged locks, no furniture overturned in a struggle. Nancy's bedroom looked almost undisturbed, the kind of scene that in any other context would suggest she'd simply left, walked out on her own, driven somewhere, made a choice. But Nancy Guthrie didn't make that choice. Because while the scene appeared calm, there were details that didn't align. Small things that suggested something had happened in that room, something that required Nancy to leave in a way she hadn't planned. The initial investigation moved quickly. Family members were contacted. Savannah Guthrie, recognizable to millions of Americans from her morning television presence, found herself on the other side of the camera, no longer asking questions, but desperately needing answers. Local law enforcement processed the scene, looking for anything that could explain where Nancy had gone. Security footage from the neighborhood was pulled. Neighbors were interviewed about unusual vehicles, unfamiliar faces, anything out of the ordinary in the days leading up to her disappearance. But those early leads didn't produce the breakthrough investigators hoped for. No one had seen Nancy leave. No one had noticed suspicious activity. The physical evidence at the scene was limited, which in itself became a kind of evidence. Because when someone disappears from their home without leaving obvious traces, it suggests a level of control. It suggests planning. It suggests that whoever was responsible understood how to move through a space without creating the kind of chaos that draws immediate attention. And then the media became part of the story. Not because journalists were covering a missing person case involving a prominent family, though they were, but because the media became the delivery system for something no one expected: ransom demands. In early February, 2 letters arrived at television stations in Arizona. One of them went to the CBS affiliate in Phoenix, where reporter Brianna Whitney would later become a key source in understanding what those letters contained. The letters claimed responsibility for Nancy's disappearance. They included instructions, and most significantly, they included a Bitcoin wallet address, a digital account where payment could be made. Ransom cases aren't common in modern America, but they do happen. What made these letters unusual wasn't just their existence, it was their delivery method. Because experienced kidnappers don't send ransom demands to television stations. They don't make their communication public. They don't risk exposure by routing their messages through channels that will inevitably involve law enforcement and media scrutiny. Real ransom situations prioritize secrecy, control, and direct communication with the victim's family. Publicity is the enemy of a successful ransom because it brings pressure, attention, and resources that make escape exponentially more difficult. But these letters went to the media, and according to sources close to the investigation, Savannah Guthrie herself reviewed the communications and determined that she believed 2 of them were legitimate. Not hoaxes from opportunists trying to exploit a tragedy, but actual correspondence from whoever had taken her mother. That assessment changed everything, because if the letters were real, then there was a channel for communication, a way to negotiate, a possibility, however slim, that Nancy could still come home. The Bitcoin wallet became the focal point. Digital currency offers a level of anonymity that traditional banking doesn't, which is why it appears in cases involving ransom, extortion, and other crimes where perpetrators want to receive payment without revealing their identity. The account listed in the letters was monitored by investigators, and likely by family members desperate for any sign of progress. And then, on February 10th, something happened. A small amount of money was deposited into the account, not a ransom payment. The amount was too small for that. But alongside the deposit came a message: "We are ready to talk, contact us." And then a link. A method for reaching whoever had sent the funds. There's no official confirmation about who made that deposit, but the timing and the message strongly suggest it came from either the FBI or the Guthrie family. Because that's exactly how negotiators operate in these situations. They don't immediately comply with demands. They signal willingness to engage. They create an opening for dialogue. And they wait to see if the other side responds. But here's where the case takes a turn that has haunted investigators for months. After that message was sent, after that attempt to establish communication, after that signal that negotiation was possible, there was no response. The Bitcoin account showed no further activity. No messages came through the provided link. No follow-up letters arrived at television stations. The person or people who had initiated contact, who had gone to the effort of sending ransom demands, who had created a system for receiving payment, simply stopped, and they haven't restarted since. To understand what that silence means, you have to understand what it violates. Real kidnappers, the kind motivated by financial gain, don't behave this way. They push, they create urgency, they remind the family what's at stake. They provide proof of life, demonstrating that the victim is alive and that payment will result in their safe return. They maintain pressure because their objective is simple: get paid and disappear. Silence works against that goal. Silence gives investigators time. Silence allows the initial shock to fade and rational decision-making to take over. Silence is the last thing a kidnapper wants. Unless the kidnapper isn't interested in money, unless the ransom was never the point. Steve, a retired FBI agent with experience in kidnapping investigations, explained the dynamics of these negotiations in a way that clarifies just how unusual this silence is. In a real ransom situation, both sides have leverage. The kidnappers have the victim, the family has the money, and both parties understand that the only way to get what they want is through exchange. That creates a negotiation where neither side can simply dictate terms. The family can't demand the victim's return without offering payment. The kidnappers can't demand payment without proving the victim is alive and safe. It becomes, as Steve described it, a zero-sum game. Both sides need each other. And that mutual dependency creates room for negotiation, for back and forth, for building toward a resolution. The FBI's role in these situations isn't to immediately comply with demands. It's to establish a framework where communication continues, where the kidnappers stay engaged, where opportunities for intelligence gathering and potential rescue operations can develop. When that message went into the Bitcoin account in February, when someone wrote, "We are ready to talk," that wasn't capitulation. That was strategy. It was the FBI or the family saying, "This isn't a situation where you make demands and we follow orders. This is a conversation. This is a process. And if you want your money, you'll need to participate in that process." But the kidnappers didn't participate. They didn't respond to the opening. They didn't counter with new demands. They didn't provide proof that Nancy was alive. They didn't do any of the things that real kidnappers do when they're serious about getting paid, which forces an uncomfortable question. Were they ever serious about getting paid? The decision-making process within the FBI on a case like this is rarely unanimous. Steve acknowledged that in any investigation involving a missing victim and ransom demands, there will be disagreement about strategy. Some voices will argue for immediate payment, suggesting that even if the ransom seems illegitimate, the risk of not paying is too great. What if they're wrong? What if the kidnappers are serious, and failure to pay results in Nancy's death? Other voices will argue for caution, pointing out that paying a ransom without proof of life sets a dangerous precedent, not just for this case, but for future crimes. It encourages others to attempt similar abductions. It signals that families of public figures are willing to pay without verification. Both arguments have merit. Both come from people who want the same outcome, Nancy's safe return. But they represent fundamentally different philosophies about how to achieve that goal. And somewhere in that tension between competing strategies, decisions get made. The family is consulted, though they're not present for every tactical discussion. They provide input about their willingness to pay, their emotional state, their priorities, but ultimately, the FBI makes recommendations based on experience, expertise, and an understanding of how these cases typically unfold. In Nancy's case, the decision appears to have been to send one signal of willingness to negotiate and then wait, to see if the kidnappers would respond, to determine whether this was a genuine ransom situation or something else entirely. Months have passed since that message was sent. Day 79 has become day 80, then 90, then beyond. And still, there has been no response, no renewed contact, no proof of life, no escalation of demands, just silence. And while the Bitcoin account has gone quiet, the investigation has not, because when the ransom angle began to look less like a genuine negotiation and more like a false trail, investigators shifted their focus to a different kind of analysis. They brought in profilers, not the dramatic television version of profiling, but the methodical, data-driven approach that the FBI has developed over decades of studying criminal behavior. These profilers don't start with imagination. They start with patterns, with statistics, with behaviors that appear across thousands of cases and begin to form recognizable categories. And one of the first statistics they considered is impossible to ignore. 92% of women who are murdered are killed by someone they know, not a stranger, not a random attacker. Someone familiar, someone who had a connection, however distant, to the victim's life. Now, at this stage, investigators aren't publicly confirming that Nancy has been killed. Officially, she remains a missing person. But profilers don't work in isolation from reality. They understand that when an 84-year-old woman disappears from her home without a trace, when ransom demands appear but never result in proof of life, when communication attempts are met with silence, the likelihood that she's still alive decreases with each passing day. And if Nancy is dead, then that 92% statistic becomes a guiding framework for understanding who might be responsible. Because if the person who took her is part of that overwhelming majority, then they didn't just randomly select a house in Tucson. They knew Nancy, maybe not intimately, maybe not in a way that would make them an obvious suspect, but enough to know where she lived, to understand her routine, to feel confident entering her space. That knowledge could come from a lot of places. Family and close friends are always examined first in cases like this, not because investigators assume guilt, but because proximity to the victim is statistically the most common factor. But the circle extends far beyond that intimate group. Contractors who worked on Nancy's home, delivery drivers who brought packages to her door, repair technicians who fixed appliances or updated systems, healthcare workers who provided in-home services, neighbors who observed her comings and goings over the years. The term "someone she knew" covers an enormous range of relationships, and most of them wouldn't be immediately obvious, because people don't remember everyone who has crossed through their lives. We forget the faces of service workers, of people who appeared briefly and then disappeared from our awareness. But those people, they don't always forget us. Sometimes they pay attention. Sometimes they remember details that we never realized were being observed. And sometimes that observation turns into something more focused, more intentional, more dangerous. Profilers working on Nancy's case have developed a picture of the kind of person who could commit this crime based not on speculation, but on behavioral indicators present in the case itself. And the word that kept appearing in their analysis is unafraid. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie wasn't acting out of panic or impulse. They moved with confidence. They executed a plan that required precision, timing, and an understanding of risk management. Think about what that means in practical terms. An 84-year-old woman doesn't disappear from her home without someone entering that space, controlling the situation, and removing her from the premises. That requires confidence. It requires belief that you can accomplish those steps without being observed, without leaving obvious evidence, without immediate discovery. That level of confidence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from one of two sources: experience or obsession. Experience means this person has done something like this before. They understand how investigations work. They know what evidence to avoid leaving. They've practiced control in high-stress situations and succeeded. They've learned from previous crimes, whether those crimes resulted in arrests or not, and they've applied those lessons to minimize risk. Obsession is different. Obsession isn't about experience. It's about emotional override. When someone becomes so focused on a particular goal, a particular person, a particular outcome, fear stops being a controlling factor in their decision-making. The objective becomes more important than the consequences. They convince themselves that they can succeed, not because they've done it before, but because they believe their plan is sound, their motive is justified, their actions are necessary. Both pathways lead to the same behavioral outcome, confidence, but they suggest very different types of offenders. If this is an experienced criminal, then investigators would be looking for connections to other unsolved cases, to patterns of behavior that might link Nancy's disappearance to other crimes. They'd be examining databases, consulting with other jurisdictions, looking for similarities that suggest a serial offender. If this is an obsessed individual, then the focus shifts to Nancy's life, and potentially more significantly, to Savannah's life. Because obsession requires a target, and while Nancy is the victim, she might not have been the true focus. This is where the case begins to take on a dimension that goes beyond random crime, or even targeted kidnapping. Because Savannah Guthrie isn't a private citizen. She's visible. She's accessible in a way that most people aren't. Millions of Americans see her face every morning. They hear her voice. They watch her interact with guests, cover news stories, share moments of her life. And for most viewers, that's where the relationship ends. They watch. They move on. They don't think about Savannah outside the context of the television screen. But for some people, that relationship doesn't end. For some people, that visibility becomes a foundation for something deeper. They start to feel like they know her. They develop opinions about her choices, her personality, her values. They interpret moments from broadcasts in ways that feel personal, that feel directed at them specifically. And when that interpretation turns negative, when they believe they've been wronged or offended or disrespected, that perception can become a motive. It doesn't matter whether the wrong is real. It only matters that the person believes it's real, because belief drives behavior. And when someone becomes convinced that a public figure has harmed them in some way, they don't need evidence. They need a target. And if they can't reach the public figure directly, they find another way to hurt them. A way that's personal, that can't be ignored, that forces the public figure to feel the kind of pain that the offender believes they themselves have experienced. Taking someone's mother would qualify. True Crime Files brings you cases that go beyond surface-level coverage. We examine the psychology, the investigative techniques, the patterns that help us understand not just what happened, but why. If you're finding value in this analysis, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the deeper we go into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the more we realize that this case is about more than a missing woman. It's about the vulnerabilities that come with visibility and the dangers of being noticed by the wrong person. The profile that emerged from this analysis describes someone who is intelligent, patient, and capable of long-term planning. Someone who understood that taking Nancy wouldn't just be about harming her. It would be about sending a message to Savannah. A message that couldn't be ignored, that would dominate her thoughts, that would transform her life from one of relative security to one of anguish and uncertainty. But even with this profile, even with the statistical likelihood that Nancy knew her abductor, investigators still face a fundamental problem. A profile can narrow the field. It can help prioritize investigative resources. It can guide the kinds of questions being asked. But it can't identify a specific person. For that, you need evidence, physical evidence that places someone at the scene. Evidence that can be tested, verified, and used to build a case that will hold up under scrutiny. And that's exactly what investigators believe they might have found. When forensic teams processed Nancy's bedroom, they worked with the understanding that human beings are messy. We shed constantly. Hair, skin cells, microscopic traces of our presence that follow us everywhere we go. You don't have to touch something to leave evidence. You just have to exist in a space for a brief period of time. And if you're in that space while committing a crime, while exerting control over another person, the likelihood that you leave something behind increases. The team found a single strand of hair. In isolation, that might not seem significant. Hair is common at any scene. But context matters. This strand was found in Nancy's bedroom, the place where she was last known to be, the place where something happened that resulted in her disappearance. And if this strand doesn't belong to Nancy, if it belongs to someone who shouldn't have been in that room, then it becomes more than just a piece of hair. It becomes a direct link to whoever was there. The strand was collected, preserved, and sent to a laboratory for initial testing. Hair analysis can be complicated. If you have the root, the follicle, the part that contains cells with nuclear DNA, you can potentially extract a full genetic profile. But if you only have the shaft, your options are more limited. You can still get mitochondrial DNA, which is useful but less specific. You can analyze characteristics like color, texture, and chemical composition, but you can't always get a clear identity. The initial testing provided some information, but not enough to identify a suspect. So investigators made a decision that signals just how important they believe this evidence could be. They sent the strand to the FBI laboratory at Quantico. And that matters because Quantico doesn't handle routine cases. When evidence goes there, it means investigators believe they have something significant. It means they want access to the most advanced testing available. Testing that uses techniques developed in just the last few years. Techniques that can extract information from samples that would have been useless a decade ago. One of those techniques involves genealogical DNA analysis. Instead of requiring a direct match to a known individual in a criminal database, genealogical analysis looks for partial matches. It identifies relatives, builds family trees, and works backward to determine who the sample might belong to. It's the same methodology that solved the Golden State Killer case after decades of dead ends. And it's now being applied to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. But even advanced DNA testing has limitations. The quality of the sample matters. The amount of genetic material available matters. And even if testing produces a usable profile, even if that profile matches someone through genealogical analysis, there's still a question that has to be answered. What does that match mean? Because presence doesn't always equal guilt. Hair can transfer indirectly. It can attach to clothing, move from one location to another, end up in places the person never physically visited. Defense attorneys understand this. They challenge the significance of trace evidence all the time. And unless the context supports the conclusion that the person was actually in that room at the relevant time, DNA alone might not be enough to secure a conviction. But context in this case is strong. Because this isn't hair found on a sidewalk or in a public space where contamination and transfer are expected. This is hair found in the bedroom of a woman who disappeared without explanation. If that hair belongs to someone who can't provide a legitimate reason for being in Nancy's bedroom, someone who has no documented relationship with her, someone whose presence contradicts their own statements, then the DNA stops being ambiguous. It becomes evidence of involvement. And that's what investigators are hoping for. A result that doesn't just provide a direction, but a destination, a name, a person who can be investigated, interviewed, and potentially charged. While they wait for those results, while the testing continues at Quantico, investigators have been working on another angle. Because physical evidence is crucial, but it's not the only tool available. Behavior matters. Choices matter. Mistakes matter. And whoever took Nancy Guthrie made several. The first mistake was choosing to involve the media. Real kidnappers avoid publicity because publicity creates risk. Once a case enters the public sphere, information spreads, people pay attention, tips come in, resources multiply. The circle of people looking for you expands exponentially. If your goal is to collect a ransom and disappear, publicity is the last thing you want. But in Nancy's case, the ransom demands went directly to television stations. That choice suggests either profound miscalculation or a different objective entirely. Because if you weren't actually trying to collect a ransom, if you were trying to accomplish something else, then publicity might serve your purpose. It might be exactly what you wanted. The second mistake was failing to provide proof of life. Experienced kidnappers understand that proof of life isn't optional. It's the foundation of any successful ransom negotiation. Without it, the family has no reason to believe payment will result in the victim's return. Without it, the FBI has no reason to recommend compliance with demands. Proof of life can be as simple as a photograph with a current newspaper, a video showing the victim speaking, a recorded message that includes details only they would know. It doesn't require risk. It doesn't require revealing location or identity. It just requires demonstrating that the victim is alive. But in this case, no proof of life was ever offered. Not in the original letters. Not after the February 10th message in the Bitcoin account. Not at any point in this entire timeline. And that absence is damning, because it suggests that providing proof of life was never an option. Not because the kidnappers chose not to, but because they couldn't. The third mistake was the silence. The decision to open a channel for communication and then abandon it without explanation. That behavior violates every pattern that appears in genuine ransom cases. Real kidnappers escalate. They create urgency. They push the family toward a decision. They maintain pressure because time is their enemy. The longer a case goes on, the more opportunities investigators have to gather intelligence, to trace communications, to build a profile, to close in. Silence gives investigators exactly what they need: time. And if the kidnappers were serious about getting paid, they would never give that advantage away. But they did give it away. They've been silent for months. And that suggests one of two possibilities. Either something went wrong, something they didn't anticipate that forced them to abandon their plan, or the plan was never what it appeared to be. If something went wrong, if there was an unexpected variable that disrupted their timeline, then investigators would be looking for evidence of that disruption, changes in behavior, signs of panic or hasty decision-making, mistakes that cascade from the initial error, digital footprints that reveal searches for information about the investigation, about how to avoid detection, about what to do when plans fail. But if the plan was never what it appeared to be, if the ransom was always a false trail designed to misdirect the investigation, then the silence isn't a mistake. It's a feature. It's part of the design. Because if your goal was to create confusion, to buy time, to make investigators focus on ransom negotiation while the real objective had already been completed, then stopping communication makes perfect sense. You created the distraction. You achieved your actual goal. And now you disappear, hoping that by the time investigators realize they've been looking in the wrong direction, the trail has gone cold. That possibility transforms the entire case. Because it means the person responsible isn't just a kidnapper. They're someone who understands how investigations work. Someone who anticipated the FBI's response. Someone who constructed a narrative specifically designed to mislead. And that level of sophistication is rare. It suggests planning that extends beyond the act itself. It suggests intelligence, patience, and a willingness to think several steps ahead. Those aren't characteristics of impulsive criminals. Those are characteristics of people who believe they can outsmart the system. But even the smartest plans have vulnerabilities. Even the most careful criminals leave traces, because human beings aren't perfect. We make assumptions that turn out to be wrong. We overlook details that seem insignificant at the time. We trust that certain things will remain hidden, when in fact, they're already being discovered. In this case, one of those traces might be the hair strand currently being tested at Quantico. Another might be digital evidence that hasn't been made public. Phone records, location data, search histories, financial transactions, the kind of information that exists in the background of modern life, invisible until investigators start looking for it. Because when you commit a crime, especially a crime that requires this level of planning, you leave a trail, maybe not at the scene itself, but in the preparation, in the research, in the communications, in the movements that led up to the act and the movements that followed. And investigators are looking for those movements. They're examining timelines. They're identifying people who changed their behavior around the time of Nancy's disappearance. People who suddenly became more cautious, more private, more aware of their digital footprint. Because changes in behavior are signals. And when those changes correlate with a major event like this disappearance, they become evidence worth investigating. The other vulnerability in sophisticated plans is other people. Because if this wasn't done alone, if there was more than one person involved, then the chances of a mistake increase dramatically. You're not just relying on your own discipline and caution, you're relying on someone else's, and people are unpredictable. They talk. They make errors. They say things they shouldn't to people they trust, who then repeat those things. Multiple person scenarios also create opportunities for leverage, because not everyone involved in a crime has the same level of commitment. Not everyone is willing to face the same consequences. And when investigators identify someone who might have peripheral knowledge, someone who wasn't directly involved but knows something, that person becomes a potential way into the case. Investigators in Nancy's case haven't publicly confirmed whether they're looking at a single suspect or multiple individuals. But the complexity of the crime, the ransom letters, the Bitcoin account, the removal of Nancy from her home, all of these elements could involve different skill sets, different roles, different levels of involvement. And if that's true, then somewhere in that network of involvement is a weak link, someone who will talk. The investigation remains active. Day 79 has become day 100, day 150, day 200. Nancy's family continues to wait. Savannah Guthrie continues to wake up every morning not knowing whether her mother is alive, whether she's suffering, whether she'll ever come home. That uncertainty is its own form of torture. And if the person responsible wanted to inflict maximum pain, if they wanted to hurt Savannah in a way that couldn't be ignored, they succeeded. But success in causing pain doesn't equal success in avoiding consequences. Because investigations like this don't simply end. They stay open. They accumulate information. They wait for the right piece of evidence to fall into place. And when it does, when that moment of clarity arrives, everything moves rapidly. The profile suggests someone who knew Nancy. The statistics suggest that knowledge is the norm rather than the exception in cases like this. The behavior suggests intelligence and planning. The silence suggests completion of an objective that didn't require ongoing communication. The evidence suggests a physical presence in Nancy's bedroom that left behind traces. All of these elements are pointing in a direction, not toward a specific person yet, but toward a type of person. Someone with access, someone with motive, someone with the capacity to plan and execute a crime this complex, someone who believed they could get away with it. And that belief might be the final mistake, because confidence can turn into overconfidence. The belief that you've thought of everything can blind you to the things you missed. The assumption that investigators will follow the false trail can underestimate their ability to recognize when something doesn't fit. Right now, somewhere in the FBI's files, in forensic labs, in databases being searched and cross-referenced, in timelines being constructed and analyzed, the answer to this case is forming. It might not be complete yet. It might not have all the pieces, but those pieces are accumulating. And the more that accumulates, the narrower the focus becomes, because that's how these investigations work. They don't start with a suspect. They start with possibilities, with a field of hundreds or thousands of potential individuals who had opportunity, who had access, who fit general parameters. And then information narrows that field, eliminates people who have alibis, eliminates people whose DNA doesn't match, eliminates people whose behavior doesn't fit the profile. And eventually, after enough elimination, you're left with a much smaller group. People who can't be eliminated. People whose presence at the scene can't be explained. People whose behavior after Nancy's disappearance changed in ways that suggest awareness or involvement. And then the investigation shifts from broad information gathering to focused pressure. Interviews become more specific. Questions become harder to deflect. Evidence that seemed insignificant earlier gets re-examined in light of new context. Connections that weren't obvious become clear. That pressure creates stress, and stress creates mistakes. People say things they shouldn't. They make decisions that seem safe at the time but later become incriminating. They trust people who don't deserve that trust. The Bitcoin account that went silent in February might not be as abandoned as it appears. Investigators have tools for tracking digital currency that most people don't understand. They can follow transactions through multiple wallets, through exchanges, through the complex pathways that cryptocurrency users employ to maintain anonymity. And sometimes those pathways lead somewhere. The ransom letters sent to television stations contain information beyond the words themselves. The way they were written, the way they were delivered, the materials used, the details included, all of that becomes subject to analysis. Handwriting experts, linguistic analysts, forensic document examiners, each specialty looking for something different, something that might provide a clue about authorship. The television stations that received those letters, particularly CBS Phoenix, where reporter Brianna Whitney has been covering the case, they have their own information. They know when the letters arrived. They know how they were delivered. They might have security footage showing who dropped them off. They might have noticed details that seemed irrelevant at the time, but matter now. All of this information flows into the investigation. It gets organized, analyzed, cross-referenced. Patterns emerge. Timelines solidify. The picture becomes clearer. And at the center of that picture is a question that still demands an answer. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Because whether she's still alive, whether she's being held somewhere against her will, whether she died on the day she was taken or sometime after, her location exists. It's a physical fact. She's somewhere, and physical facts can be discovered. If she's being held, then someone is providing that location. Someone is making sure it remains hidden. Someone is taking resources, time, and risk to maintain that situation. And the longer that maintenance continues, the more opportunities there are for discovery. If she died, then her remains are somewhere, and remains can be found. Searches can be conducted. Terrain can be examined. Technology exists that can detect disturbances in soil, changes in vegetation, anomalies that suggest recent human activity. The most difficult scenario for resolution is if Nancy's body was moved to a location that's difficult to search: water, remote wilderness, locations that would require enormous resources and specific intelligence to narrow down. But even those scenarios aren't impossible. They're just harder. And this case has enough national attention, enough resources, enough motivation from law enforcement and family that hard doesn't mean abandoned. The truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie exists. It exists in the mind of whoever was responsible. It exists in physical evidence that hasn't been fully analyzed yet. It exists in digital trails that are still being traced. It exists in statements that haven't been made, in observations that haven't been reported, in connections that haven't been recognized. That truth is moving toward discovery, maybe slowly, maybe with setbacks and false leads, maybe with months of work that produce nothing, until suddenly they produce everything. But it's moving. And when it finally surfaces, When the investigation reaches the point where evidence becomes indictment, where suspicion becomes certainty, the silence that has defined this case will break. Because silence isn't sustainable forever. Someone will talk, some piece of evidence will connect, some mistake will become visible, and Nancy Guthrie's family will finally get the answer they've been waiting for since the day she disappeared. Whether that answer brings the closure they hope for, whether it brings peace or just more pain, whether it allows them to begin healing or forces them to confront something even worse than uncertainty, only time will reveal. But the answer is coming. The investigation continues. The testing continues. The analysis continues. Day by day, piece by piece, the truth is being assembled. And somewhere, the person responsible is waiting, watching the news coverage, monitoring the investigation's progress, wondering if the hair strand will lead back to them, wondering if the digital trails they thought were hidden are actually being traced, wondering if the person they trusted to stay quiet is already talking. That uncertainty, that pressure, that knowledge that every day could be the day the knock comes on the door, that might be its own form of justice. Because living with the knowledge of what you've done, living with the constant awareness that discovery is possible, living with the understanding that the life you're trying to protect could collapse at any moment, that's not freedom. That's a different kind of prison. And it lasts until the moment the physical prison arrives. At True Crime Files, we follow these cases from beginning to resolution. We don't just cover the sensational moments. We examine the investigative process, the techniques that solve cases, the patience and persistence that eventually break through the silence. If this analysis has given you insight into how complex investigations actually work, if you want to continue following Nancy Guthrie's case and others like it, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and that you've liked this video, because this case isn't over, and when the resolution comes, we'll be here to examine what it means and how it was achieved. The story of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is ultimately a story about absence, the absence of answers, the absence of proof, the absence of communication from whoever took her, the absence of Nancy herself from the life she should still be living. But absence isn't emptiness. Absence is a space waiting to be filled. And investigators are working every day to fill that space with truth. Because 84-year-old women don't simply vanish from their homes without reason. Someone had a reason. Someone made a choice. Someone acted. And choices leave consequences. Those consequences are still unfolding. The DNA testing at Quantico is still in progress. The behavioral analysis is still identifying potential suspects. The digital forensics are still tracing communications. The interviews are still being conducted. All of it building toward a moment when the scattered pieces align into a complete picture. When that moment comes, when investigators can finally say with certainty what happened and who was responsible, the silence breaks. Not just the silence from the kidnappers, the silence of unanswered questions, the silence of a family waiting for truth. All of it breaks. And Nancy Guthrie's story moves from mystery to resolution. That day hasn't arrived yet, but the investigation suggests it's coming, because this case has too much attention, too many resources, too much at stake to simply fade away. Someone took an 84-year-old woman from her home. Someone sent ransom demands they never intended to fulfill. Someone created a trail of evidence they believed they'd hidden. Someone made choices that felt safe at the time, but might already be unraveling. And somewhere in the intersection of those choices, those pieces of evidence, those patterns of behavior, the truth is waiting. Waiting to be discovered. Waiting to be proven. Waiting to transform this case from an open investigation into a closed one. The question isn't whether that transformation will happen. The question is when, and what the truth will reveal about the person who thought they could make Nancy Guthrie disappear. Because people don't disappear. Not really. They go somewhere. And someone knows where that somewhere is. That someone might be watching this right now. Might be calculating their next move. Might be wondering if they should run or stay, talk or remain silent, trust their plan or acknowledge it's already failed. Those calculations are their own form of pressure. And pressure eventually produces results. Either the person breaks and makes a mistake that leads to their discovery, or the evidence accumulates to the point where their identity becomes undeniable regardless of their actions. Either way, the outcome moves in one direction, toward truth, toward resolution, toward the moment when Nancy Guthrie's family finally understands what happened to someone they love. That moment is built on the work happening right now in laboratories and investigative offices and digital forensics units. Work that doesn't make headlines. Work that takes time and patience and expertise. Work that slowly, methodically, carefully assembles the answer this case demands. And when that answer arrives, it won't just close this investigation. It will provide something more fundamental. Understanding, not just of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but of why someone believed they could take her. Why they believed they could use her disappearance to hurt her daughter. Why they believed they could construct a false ransom scenario and disappear into silence. Those beliefs were wrong, and the evidence proving they were wrong is being gathered right now, piece by piece, day by day, until the silence that has defined this case is finally, permanently broken.